Welcome to Grade 1 Planning from Data to Instruction. I am your host tonight. My name is Melissa Monette Smith, and I am a Grade 1 teacher in York Region District School Board. But before we jump into it, and there's a lot to get through tonight, we are going to begin in a good way. We acknowledge that ONLit's work takes place on the traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory, now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. So you are joining us tonight for the Grade 1 from planning to the planning and instruction based on our data. Tonight's agenda, we are going to be using diagnostic and universal screening data to inform our instruction. Then we're going to look at the language block and how I've structured it. And we're also going to be looking at some instructional routines and connected practice, as well as some progress monitoring. So before we do that, I want to have a few disclaimers. While a lot of the things that I'm doing in this webinar and showing you in this webinar are rooted in evidence and based in science, there is definitely an art to teaching. And a lot of the things I do, I might do it in my own way, and I encourage you to do that also. It's rooted in science, but I also find ways to bring the things that make teaching joyful for me to my students. I will also recognize that I do have a lot of tools available to me. I have been on this structured literacy journey for a few years, and so I've already gone ahead and collected a lot of resources, and I know that not everybody has the same access to those resources. Where possible, I will be also telling you about free examples and ways that you can do that in your classrooms when I know you might not have the same access that I have. The other thing that I want to say is that a lot of what I'm talking about tonight does rest on the shoulders of Laura Bross. So if you have not watched our ONlit team member Laura Bross's webinar on the grade 2-3 planning, it really is a must see. We can put the link in the chat there for you. She goes a lot deeper into the research on instructional practice and explicit instruction. She talks about cognitive load theory. She just has so many amazing pieces in there that it really is a must watch. And I think together you'll get a very clear picture of what we can be doing in our classrooms. I will be talking mostly about the context with my actual students in my class. And again, I recognize that your data might look different than my data. Where possible, I'm also going to give examples as to what you could be doing if your data is a little bit scarier, if maybe it's not showing you some things that the same way that mine is showing you. We're going to try and work through that together. So thinking about that, here's how it's all going to work. We are in a webinar format just by the sheer volume of you. So if you do have something that you would like to participate in, you can use the chat function. If you have a question, however, please use that Q&A function. It allows some of the people that are working here behind the scenes to sort of monitor those questions. And it gives an idea for everybody, like we're able to answer those questions for you. It promotes that accessibility. And again, use those chats. If you're going to chat with us, we are the hosts and panelists, and you can see it or you can send it just to everyone. So those are some choices there for you. So without further ado, we are going to get into it. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is using that diagnostic and universal screening data to inform our instruction. So, assessment for learning. When we are planning literacy instruction, it's crucial to be using tools that provide assessment for learning. The chart that you see here comes from ONlit leader Una Malcolm. She did this through LD at School, and it highlights all the pieces in a comprehensive assessment system. These are things that should be used by the schools both to prevent reading difficulties, but also to provide guidance on intervention and remediation skills. For tonight's webinar, we're going to be focusing on these two factors, the universal screeners and diagnostic assessments. I'm going to be showing you how I use both of those tools to determine the instructional starting points on the scope and sequence that I've chosen. A little later on, we'll also be looking at progress monitoring, which I use both formally and through Acadians, but also informally through something called the Daily Pen Review, which have really helped me determine whether or not my intervention and my whole group instruction is effective. I believe that we can put that in the chat there too, the link to LD at school. So that's something for you to look through if you want. It's a really handy chart. So what we need to think about is the timing of these assessments. When we're thinking back now, it's December 4th, but thinking back those 3 months ago to the beginning of September, we really do want to get to know our students, right? These types of assessments are not things that we want to do bang on the first day of school. You're not going to see me do spelling tests or reading tests until I know who the kids are in my classroom. We did a lot of community building those first few weeks, a lot of learning for the fun of it. We really wanted to get to know these students. This year, I actually had the luxury of having 5 of the kids that I taught last year in kindergarten, which really helped me sort of gauge my relationships in the classroom and being able to see how the other students were doing. It allowed me a nice starting point too, because I already had 5 kids that I had some strong relationships with. So really get to know your students before you launch into any kind of diagnostic or formal assessment with them. The other thing that you want to think about is to begin testing when you're ready to make those responsive changes to your instruction, right? You want to make sure that you're doing these assessments for a reason and that you're ready to use those results, right? So again, those first few weeks of school, we're really focusing on routines and reviewing materials from kindergarten. We did sort of a alphabet boot camp those first few weeks where I was really making sure that everything that I had hoped had been taught in kindergarten was, giving them the opportunity to learn that and access that knowledge again. I had a back of my mind goal of really starting on that grade 1 scope and sequence at the end of September. So that gave me a little bit of time to really think about what I wanted to be doing in those first 3 weeks with that community building. And I could pick and choose which assessments I was doing because of when I was ready to make responsive changes. In my school, we almost always have a reorganization at the end of September. So I didn't want to get too far into my grade 1 learning because I wasn't sure if I was going to end up getting students, which of course I ended up getting new students. So waiting a little bit of time for that allowed a more seamless transition for them. Again, I wanted to spend time building those instructional routines to support their learning. I could do that using that kindergarten material. So I didn't exactly need to know what they could and could not do in terms of grade 1 just yet. I was able to use that kindergarten knowledge and work with that alphabet over and over and over again while I was building those new routines that we would be doing. And I'll show you some of those routines in a little bit. The other thing that was really helpful to me was to layer the assessments as I required the data, right? So at the beginning of the year, there's a few things that I'm checking on. I want to check on their sounds. I want to check on their ability to use those sounds to read and spell words. I'm also curious about their ability to read and spell high frequency words, but that wasn't as pressing to me. So I waited a little bit of time to look at those high frequency words until I had established some of those routines. So what I did next was use a diagnostic assessment to make sure that I knew where I could start on this scope and sequence. So we're going to put that in the chat there, Appendix A. If you have not seen Appendix A from the new curriculum, it is such a handy tool because it outlines what should be taught in both kindergarten and grade 1, that's its own column, as well as grades 1, 2, and 3, and 4, depending on those foundational skills listed in Strand B, B2 specifically. So that's what's in the chat there. If you've never seen it, really, this is a handy go-to. I use it as a checklist in my classroom. It's really handy to make sure that I know I have all these pieces. One thing that we need to remember is that kindergarten is voluntary in Ontario, right? It is not a mandatory program, and we can't assume that kids come to us knowing the things that we would hope that they would know coming out of a kindergarten program. That's why we start with the alphabet always. We're always going to start with the alphabet, but what we need to determine is how quickly can we go through that alphabet so that we can reach the beginning of that grade 1 curriculum. Those first 2 weeks of school, like I said, when I was establishing those routines and I'm gathering the data that I need, we are doing the alphabet every single day. In the routines that I'm about to show you, that's where that alphabet comes in. so that by the time I'm ready to start at the end of September, we have worked with those letters, and I can be pretty certain that the majority of the kids in my class are able to use the alphabet in the ways that I need them to use. You might be really familiar with diagnostics such as core phonics or scholastic red. It really doesn't matter which one that you choose, but you want to choose a diagnostic that's going to confirm the phonics skills that have been consolidated and which ones might need backfilling. So again, thinking about Appendix A, if we look at the SK1 column on Appendix A, we can see that some of the important skills that they should have left, again, I say should, being like this is an ideal world, but ideally they can identify and isolate phonemes, they can orally blend and segment phonemes into words, that they have uppercase and lowercase naming and formation skills, and that they're able to read and spell short words containing consonants, short vowels, and some digraphs. That was the very first thing that I wanted to check to see if they were able to do. So again, this comes directly from Appendix A, the SK1 column. These are the skills that I'm using my diagnostic at the very beginning of the year to make sure that they can do. So like I said, Core Phonics is a great one. It's easily available online. Really great reading is another place where they have a lot of free diagnostics. The one that you're seeing here, I did create with a partner of mine. We really borrowed heavily from Core Phonics, but because we were supporting teachers who were, this was when I was in a regional role, we were supporting teachers who were using the program UFly. We wanted to reorganize the diagnostic so that it matched the order that UFly taught the skills. And the reason why we did that was we were finding that it took a lot of time to look at our diagnostic from Core Phonics and then realign it to our scope and sequence from UFly. And that time we just didn't, it was kind of time wasted. So we just reorganized the words, which allowed us to see the skills in the order that the program was teaching. So you can see here on this diagnostic, we're looking at their ability to read both nonsense and actual words that were short vowels and CVCs, then short vowels with blends, short vowels with digraphs, and then the first long vowel spelling that we would want to teach them would be the magic E. So you can see that from this diagnostic, it is quite simple. Within the first 3 rows here, every letter of the alphabet is there. So we're also able to check to see if they have the right alphabet sounds. That data we then would transfer over to a chart. Now, the thing that's really nice about doing it digitally is that we could color code. And you will see as we go through the webinar, color coding is my thing. I really like something visual and easy to check. So just looking at this, you can see this is the actual data from my class. You can see the skills across the top that I was looking at. Could they say the short vowel sounds, and where were they on digraphs, consonant blends, and then magic E? I'm going to give you just a second here to look, and feel free to pop it in the chat if you want. But do you see any spots visually, an instructional starting point? Do you see any places on this chart where the majority of my students were showing that they didn't have those skills yet? In case it's not glaringly obvious, the green is a Y for yes, meaning yes, they had those skills, and the N is no. So that would color code as red. If you look at this chart, are you able to see where some majority places were lacking? So I see some people putting stuff in the chat here. So I'm just going to go ahead and look. Yep, I got that. A lot of people are seeing the L blends. Yep, digraphs, blends and magic E. Very good. Consonant clusters, yes. Now, I will say that I do know that when we're talking about blends and consonant blends, that there is a lot of research saying that you do not need to teach these separately. And, cognitive load theory would say that that's adding to it. Absolutely. If that's how it's working for your kids, wonderful. I have always found that because they're not necessarily taught in kindergarten, then I like to check to make sure that they can do it. Some kids are magically able to read the blend as it is, but it's been my experience that a little bit of explicit instruction is needed. So when we look here, you can see absolutely that of my 22 students, about half of them were still consolidating those digraphs. Another 70% were not able to read those consonant blends. So I knew that these were places where I needed to start. There were 3 students in my class who were able to read every single sound, and those kids actually were able to read well beyond sounds that I would anticipate in grade 1. I sort of followed this assessment up with the primary spelling inventory, which comes from Words Their Way, just to see if they were able to spell the words that they were able to read. And it showed me the same thing. The vast majority of kids were reading spelling CVC words with no issues, but they had trouble with the spelling of any kind of word with a blend or with a digraph. You'll also notice here that I did have some students who were showing that they didn't necessarily have complete proficiency with their short vowels. I wasn't too worried about these kids at first because if I'm going to start with digraphs, which is what my data was showing me I needed to do, I would be using short vowels at the same time. So I could kind of teach those things together. And you'll see a little bit later on that I do a lot of work around vowels. So I knew that these kids would get the extra support that they needed with that. This shot here just shows you how I would track. I like anecdotal notes. I like to do things by hand when I'm actually listening to kids because I can make little notes. You can see here I was circling sounds that I didn't, like words that she wasn't able to get. And I put a little note here of do a full sound inventory. I wasn't confident that this kid had all of their alphabet sounds, so I wanted to look in on that. This student here, it's hard to see on your screen maybe, but there are 2 different colors happening here. The purple was the one at the beginning of the year, and you can see I'm saying they're not blending back. So she had the sounds, but wasn't actually saying the word. So for instance, they might say et for let, but not actually saying let afterwards. And in this one here, you can see same thing that my note was that they needed to build the fluency with reading the CVC. We needed to review some digraphs. The blue on this one was done a few weeks later, right? So you can see that I'm saying, okay, we're blending words here, but there's some issues with, she's saying the rhyme and then blending. So this kid was saying jud. So she wasn't segmenting each sound first, but she was starting to group them together. And you can see my note here again of the fluency with digraphs. So this is just what I'm tracking while the kids are reading. And that was my way of making sure. Again, I'm checking to see, can they read CVC words? Can they read words with digraphs and blends? And where are we in terms of that magic E? The majority of my kids in the class were needing that support on a review on the digraphs and then the explicit instruction in the blends. So how did I put that together? What did that mean? I had a group of kids who needed support with short vowels. I had a group of kids who were missing alphabet sounds. So you saw on one of those notes there that I went to check to see if they had all of their alphabet sounds. And there was about 3 or 4 that I sort of did a deeper dive on, and they were missing. On average, I think one of the kids was missing about 50% of the sounds, but the majority of them were missing about a third of their sounds. So I knew I needed to work on that. I had a large group of kids who weren't reading vowel consonant, consonant vowels, or consonant vowel consonant words. A good chunk of my kids were kind of reading CVC words, but they were still building fluency with that. And then I had a group that were starting to build fluency beyond that CVC with those digraphs and blends. And then I had this other group of kids who were already approaching the end of year for grade 1 or were already at the end of scope and sequence. So those were kids that I knew that phonics instruction is not what they needed. So I had to pay attention to that. This here, what's underneath the gray box here, this is where I decided to start my whole group instruction. This is where the majority of the class was. They were needing support with building fluency with CVC, and they were ready to continue along the scope and sequence in learning digraphs and blends. This group here, like I mentioned, they didn't need this type of instruction, but I knew that having them be a part of whole group instruction wasn't going to harm them. It would be a really great review and it would support their spelling, but I needed to keep them in the back of my mind for when I do my small group or my connected practice, because they don't need the phonics support. So I need to be giving something that is of a challenge to them. Again, the short vowel students that were missing those, I wasn't too worried because I do know that my whole group instruction focuses a lot on short vowels. So I was pretty confident that I would be able to meet their needs, but I would have to keep checking in on that. So this group here became my very first priority group. The students who were missing alphabet sounds and who were not yet reading short 2-letter or 3-letter words, they were the group that I wanted to work with on a more frequent basis in a more intense way. In terms of my 22 kids, this worked out to be about 7 students. So I had 7 students in this priority group that I needed to start working with intentionally and intensively to get their skills up to where the rest of the class was. So what if your data is a little bit more concerning, right? So this data here that I'm showing you is not true data. It's not coming from my class or anything like that. But this is an idea, again, of what if we were tracking every sound? So you'll see across the top, I know it's quite small on your screen, I apologize for that, but you'll see across the top that the letter concepts are not in order. Again, instead of doing the screener in alphabetical order, I did it in order that they are taught in the scope and sequence that I use. That allows me to check the data and then immediately take that data and go to my scope and sequence and use the lessons as I go. So you'll see that this is a little bit hard to see this way. So I'm going to change it and just sort the data. So that's the nice thing about having digital data, is that you can use that sort feature and you can get everything together. You don't have to break your brain looking at the data. Again, put it in the chat if you want. Is there anything that you notice about this data? Is there anything you can see about any trends that you're seeing about letters that might be missing, or the number of students who are missing a good chunk of that, of their sounds? Is there anything jumping out at you? Yeah, we've got some P there. Vowels again are an issue. Yeah. Vowels are almost always an issue. They are really, really tricky. Yeah, Jenny saying there, the letters at the end of the scope and sequence. Absolutely. So when we think about this, you'll notice that on this pretend data, that only 50% of the class have all their letter sounds, right? And when you think about that coming into grade 1, to be able to say, well, only 50% of my class has the alphabet, that's overwhelming. That is a scary place to be. There's a lot for us to do there. You can also see that that there are 4 students who have less than 50% of their sounds, right? So they are not working with a whole lot yet. We will get them there, but when they're coming to you, they're not quite where you would anticipate them to be. And then if you went sound by sound, you will see that there are some commonly missed sounds. P, I, N, those vowels there, and you'll notice that they are not the common sounds, right? Like J and Y and V, Q, U. Letters that we don't necessarily see very often are often missing from a student's repertoire. So what would we do? Well, in my line of work in my classroom, what we would call this is a whole group problem, right? 50% of your class is missing what they need in order to move on. I can't small group my way out of that. I need to boost my tier 1 instruction. I need to review the alphabet, but I need to do it really quickly. I don't have time to start at letter P and go sound by sound. I have to be doing this at a very accelerated pace because I need to get to that grade 1 curriculum. If it were my class, I'd be doing 4 or 5 sounds a week. As I mentioned in how I did it in September, not knowing where my kids' skills were, we spent a lot of time doing that alphabet bootcamp where we were doing a sound a day, getting through it, really focusing on each of those sounds. I always had the alphabet and we were using all of the sounds all of the time. So while if you have a class like this that are missing a lot of the sounds, you still need to focus on that explicit instruction. And again, I will be going through some of those routines that could be useful for that, but you need to be doing it at a very accelerated pace. If you are doing 1 sound a week on the kindergarten scope and sequence, then you're not likely to get to the grade 1 scope and sequence in time. I went through and I counted the grade 1 scope and sequence, whether you agree with how the government has laid it out or not. There are about 50 concepts that are required to be taught in grade 1. So even in the grade 1, you think about a school year being about 40 weeks. If we went 1 sound a week in grade 1, we wouldn't get through all of those concepts. I am counting like Magic E as 5 concepts, for instance, rather than just 1, but there are a lot of concepts to do in grade 1. We absolutely need to make sure that the alphabet is there before we continue to build, but we have to do it at a pace that is perky enough and intense enough that we don't keep them falling behind. We have to get to that grade 1. So I would do a really intensive 3 or 4 week alphabet blitz where we are doing all of the alphabet all of the time, perhaps highlighting one sound a day. And then I would retest. Let's see where we're at to see if we are able now to move on, right? If we are still missing those sounds 2 to 3 weeks later, okay, as a whole group, we need to consolidate this and keep going. But we should be stopping and checking to see if we're ready to move on. We're going to be talking about those systematic programs such as UFly, and a lot of these alphabet concepts come back again and again. So it's actually okay to keep going with things like digraphs because those other consonants don't just magically disappear. You will still get to review those, but we do really need to think about how quickly we get to that grade 1 curriculum and if we are going through the review fast enough. Ideally, again, we're going to work on this and retest so that we can bring us up to that grade 1 scope and sequence as soon as possible. The kindergarten scope and sequence for a program like UFly is 34 lessons. So if you're only doing that the way that they lay it out, which is 2 sounds a week, that's still 17 weeks. So we really want to be doing multiple sounds a week to really get the alphabet going so that we can get onto that grade 1 scope and sequence. So you can see here, if this were my class, this would be my priority grouping, right? Here are the kids that are missing the majority of their sounds. We would be doing all of the sounds whole group, and then this group would get a second dosage of that explicit instruction. So thinking about, I've said the word scope and sequence. I've said it many times at this point with the hopes that maybe that you understand what it is, but just in case you're not sure, that scope and sequence is that plan, right? It is the plan of which sounds that you are going to teach in which order. When we think about the English language, there's 26 letters, there's 44 phonemes, depending on who you ask, and then those phonemes and letters come together in about 200 different ways to form those spellings. That is incredibly overwhelming when you think about it that way. But if we realize that we can go bit by bit in an order, that would be really helpful in keeping us organized. There is not one single scope and sequence that should be followed over another, as long as there has been some thought going into it. I personally wouldn't teach the letters in alphabetical order because I can't make words very well with those first 6 letters of the alphabet. But if you're using chances are if you're using a commercial program like UFly, then a lot of smart people have come together to decide the order. You want to make sure that your scope and sequence is a sequence that goes from simple concepts to complex and teaches those high frequency spellings before their low frequency spellings. Again, if you're using a commercial product, chances are that that has already been determined for you. So I took my diagnostic data, which told me that I was able to start with, I needed to start at digraphs, even though they were part of the SK1 continuum, and that they were kind of ready for blends. So I took that information and I thought about my long range plan. This is my actual long range plan. Again, I apologize that it is so small, but you kind of get the idea that I have weeks going across the top for each month of the year. And then I'm just using the commercial scope and sequence in order that they're teaching me. This is just for my B2. I do have a much more developed long range plan, but we're not going to get into it in the time that we had tonight. But maybe there'll be a part 2 and we can talk about those other pieces. But you can see here that I've got my phonics concepts as well as my morphology concepts in a plan of how I am teaching them. It's not always possible to get two concepts a week, but that is the goal. Some concepts are meatier than others, and some weeks are shorter than others, right? So you know what you have coming up at your school, whether or not you can follow a program and do as many sounds as you can. If you are following UFly, they do recommend 2 sounds a week, and they do that on a day 1 and a day 3. I like to do all of my stuff on a Monday because that just sets me up for the week and I'm able to just review those sounds constantly. One of the colleagues of mine who teaches a 2-3, she likes to do it on the Tuesday because she does her progress monitoring on a Monday and that helps her determine if she's able to go on. There's lots of different ways to do that, but again, keeping it at a pace that gets us through. But I'm also going to progress monitor along the way. So I know that I'm not going too fast. I don't want to go faster than them acquiring the skills. So progress monitoring, and I'll walk you through that in a little bit, is a really great way to do that. I also want to interleave the concepts. So this is the idea that I am intentionally coming back to previously taught concepts. Again, if you are using a commercial product such as UFly, that is done for you. If I'm teaching A in kindergarten, that A, short vowel A, is going to come back over and over and over again. If you are using your own program or a program that you're developing yourself, that's totally okay. But you want to make sure that it's not this one and done teaching, right? Teaching doesn't always mean like just because you taught it doesn't mean they learned it. So you want to make sure that they have the opportunity to come back to that and practice that skill over and over and over again. So we've done our diagnostic. That was just a core phonics type diagnostic where I was looking at their actual phonics skill. Now I'm going to talk about universal screening. Universal screening was mandated by the province last year for all students in year 2 up to grade 2, but the school boards were able to select their own screener. My school board selected Acadians, which I was very happy with because I've been using Acadians for a few years now, and that's where all my training is. So I will be using Acadians as my example tonight. If you are using something other than Acadians, this is still valid for you and still relevant because these screeners were all sort of born out of the same idea. They're just packaged a little bit differently. You'll also see that I'll be sharing this at the end, but tomorrow night we do have one of our data check-ins, our cat chat check-ins about data. So if you have a different screener, I do encourage you to come to that where we can specifically talk about your screener as well. So at the beginning of the year in grade 1 for Acadians, we're looking at these 3 things: letter naming fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, and nonsense word fluency. Now, I've seen a lot of chatter online about how these are not relevant to the Ontario context because it's not what we teach them in grade 1. So I just thought I would take a very short amount of time to show you how they are related. Again, using that Appendix A, when we look at letter naming fluency, which is a brief direct measure on a student's ability to name letters quickly, you can see that the naming uppercase and lowercase letters both in and out of order with automaticity in various fonts, like this is part of our curriculum. This is from Appendix A. It is directly related to what we are doing in Ontario. In terms of phoneme segmentation fluency, again, when we look at Appendix A, you can see that it very clearly says that students need to be able to segment the sounds of spoken words containing up to 5 phonemes. I will absolutely admit that I have not gone through all of Acadians' phoneme words to see if they go beyond 5 phonemes, but at this point, I cannot think of any words where they have gone beyond that. So again, this phoneme segmentation and their ability to say the sounds and segment the sounds spoken in words is really important both to their ability to decode and encode words. And here it is right in our curriculum. And lastly, again, that nonsense word fluency. So that again is a brief direct measure of that alphabetic principle, the idea that students are understanding that these letters are that they're seeing, these shapes that they're seeing are representative of sounds and that the sounds come together to make a word. While we're not going to go out of our way to teach nonsense words, you can see in the curriculum here that reading CVC words and spelling those CVC words are directly related to what we are doing. So when we look at this data, it's important for me to talk about one thing. We've been mandated to do beginning of the year, and if they did not meet benchmark, then we do need to screen them in the middle of the year. While I'm not going to tell you what you have to do, I will explain why I am choosing to do that January benchmark also, that middle of the year. Because you can see here that while at the beginning of the year, for nonsense word fluency, they only needed to read 1 whole word. The January benchmark, they'll need to read 8. And that is a very large jump. right? If I am not checking to make sure that they are able to make that jump, then some kids might get lost along the way. The other thing about that January benchmark is that we introduce oral reading fluency. So this is a new subtest where it's on the middle of the year as well as the end of the year. And it's more like true reading, right? We're checking how many words correct on an actual passage that is not decodable. They are able to read in 1 minute. I don't know about you, but I'm going to make sure that they are able to do that. And one of the easiest ways, because I have the program and the access to me, is to do that Acadians in January, because it will allow me to see if I have any students struggling on that, and that I will be able to make any corrections before I send them off to grade 2. Again, there have been complaints on social media that these passages are not related, but I just thought, again, I would put this here for you. These are all of the phonics concepts that we're expected to teach in grade 1. And if it feels overwhelming, it's because it is. There are a lot of pieces there. Again, like I said, I went through and I sort of counted, and I am being a little bit on the excited side of counting each vowel sound as its own thing, because sometimes you do need to teach them separately. But there is a lot that we need to get through. And all of these concepts find themselves on that oral reading fluency. And I want to make sure that my kids are making progress with that. So looking at the Acadians benchmarks, what they are doing, the Acadians gives you information on benchmark goals. So these are empirically derived, they've been criterion referenced, and they are target scores that represent adequate reading skill for a particular grade at a particular time of the year. So we're looking for a level of skill where the student is likely to achieve the next reading skill, right? So students who achieve that benchmark goal, the odds are in their favor of also achieving later benchmark goals. So if you had students on your universal screeners who were well below, the important thing to know about that is that they need intensive support. These students are likely going to require intensive support to reach that next benchmark. If they were below, they will need some strategic support. That could be just a little bit of small group time. That could be a tweak to your whole group instruction, but something needs to be done. If they were at or above, so at would be green, above would be blue, then they'll likely to need core support. And what they mean by core support is, again, that evidence-based tier 1 instruction that is grade appropriate for them. This right here is a snapshot from the Acadians benchmarks. Again, if you're using EasyCBM or if you're using AimsWeb, you'd want to look, AimsWeb Plus, sorry, you'd want to look at theirs. But you can see that the benchmark changes over time because we would expect their skills to look over time, to change over time. So let's look at my data again of my 26 students. This was our phoneme segmentation fluency. And I have to remind you that I did this a few weeks after my diagnostic. Part of the reason for that was I didn't have access to the online platform until middle of October. I think in next year I would do it a little bit earlier because my groups did need to change because of what I found out in my Acadians results. So this was the phoneme segmentation, and this was the one that surprised me. I was a little bit floored by this and a little bit taken aback, if only because we do phoneme segmentation in my class a lot. It is something that I'm very comfortable with doing and something that we did all of the time in my classes. So to see this was like, what's going on? And then I did a little bit of reflection and I realized that for the most part, I was doing phoneme segmentation fluency as a whole group practice. And when you do everything whole group, yes, that's efficient, but it's easy for kids to sort of pretend that they're doing what they needed to do. And when I got those kids one-on-one, it was clear to me that, well, you know what? I needed to spend a little bit more time. So you can see that this is almost half of my class. I knew that my whole group instruction on phoneme segmentation was very strong and that it was meeting the needs of a lot of my students. So what I did was I decided to start pulling kids individually. So I knew I was doing it okay as a whole group, but I did need to make this a small group priority also. This is my nonsense word fluency correct letter sounds. So given the diagnostic data that I had, I was actually really happy with this because I had 7 kids who were struggling with reading actual words. So to see that their fluency with correct letter sounds was okay, made me feel really good. One thing to note about the correct letter sounds is I did have these 3 students who, when I looked at the correct letter sounds and their whole word reading together, I noticed that these 3 students had a lot of whole words. So they were reading words really, really well, but again, they were doing it slowly. That's an important thing to look at when we look at this data is, can we answer the question of why might this data be how it is? And though I still need their correct letter sounds to be more fluent, because that's how they're going to read with more fluency. And when we read with more fluency, we read with more comprehension. I wasn't as worried about these kids because they were developing another skill at the same time. When I looked at our whole words, a little bit more than my half my class made that benchmark. The thing that really concerned me is that you only needed one word, right? So you only needed one word to meet that benchmark this time. And so while it was great that so many of my kids were meeting that, I really wanted them to see further ahead. So I looked at my data a little bit more closely, and I could see that 6 of these kids had only met the benchmark as getting that one. We need to remember that that benchmark score is the lowest level of okay. It's not a B. It's not related to our report card mark. It's that lowest level of okay before we need to worry. So I wanted to keep my eye on these kids. The ones that were reading well above benchmark, well, it was okay. I was going to worry a little bit less, but I knew that that January benchmark, that they had a long way to go if they were only able to read that one word. So when we looked at the 2 pieces of my diagnostic data and my universal screening, I needed to come up with those priority groups. I had already established that I had a group that needed support with decoding and encoding those CVC words and beginning to use those digraphs. But now I also had a group of kids who were having trouble segmenting longer words and kids who weren't reading whole words with any kind of fluency. When I looked at that screener data, I determined that I could support a lot of those students during my soft entry. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And that I could do some of that whole word reading work in that tier 1. I could boost my whole group instruction so that we were supporting more of those learners because a good chunk of my class needed help with that. And again, I can't small group my way out of a whole group problem. When I looked at this diagnostic data, again, looking at the decoding and the encoding and those kids who still were struggling with CVC and digraphs, they were still the ones that I was going to support with that connected practice, that small group learning, and that I could support a lot of them in my soft entry also. But what if my data was more concerning? Right? So I can hear some of you saying, but my data didn't look like that. And we do know that there were classes, even in my school board, there were classes where nobody met benchmark. So what am I going to do in those cases? So when we look at that segmentation fluency, if the majority of your kids, or if none of your kids are meeting those benchmarks, we need to increase the intensity and the frequency of the practice, right? So looking at your whole group instruction, how often are we having them segment those phonemes out loud? You don't have to do this through one-on-one explicit instruction or like a whole group of teacher student back and forth. You can do it through activities and build it throughout the day. One of the activities that my kids love, which is a great brain break, we call it blast off. A kid picks a word, we're all standing around the room, say the word was clown, we would crouch down into a little ball and we would say clown, break it apart. Oh, ow, and we're getting higher and higher as we do it. And then we jump up and we say that clown word. Those are great ways. There's that multisensory approach for those kids who really need to feel themselves move. The other thing with phoneme segmentation fluency is that you can continue to practice it with and without letters. You don't need a full fancy program that's going to take 20 minutes out of your day to work on all of those phonemic awareness activities. You can just specifically work on the blending and segmenting of sounds, both orally and with and without letters. Well, what if our issues were with nonsense word fluency and those correct letter sounds? Again, we need to increase the automaticity with those letter sounds through engaging games and activities and doing that with whole group. Again, if the majority of your kids need it, you need to do it with the majority of your kids. We need to increase the frequency of these activities. If you're only doing these types of activities once or twice a week, try doing them every day. You can also try and do them at multiple points in the day. We can also make sure that our connected practice, or those small group activities that you're choosing, support the building fluency with those letter sounds. If we're having trouble with the whole word reading, which was an issue in my class, you'll see, we need to continue to build the fluency with the letter sounds, because that building block of knowing what the sounds say and knowing what the sounds say quick enough will help us to read those whole words. Again, including those activities where they are encouraged to say the sounds in their head rather than out loud. This was a big game changer in my class. We were doing a lot of saying each sound. So for instance, web, but we've moved to them saying it in their head as I point to the sounds, and then we read them out loud. That type of practice has made a big difference in my class in them being able to read whole words more quickly. The other thing that we started doing after I've explicitly taught the sounds is, for instance, if I have W-E-B, and then I take away the B and it has a T now, I'll say, if this says web, then this says, and I take one of those sounds away, then they'll read it as a whole word. So again, getting them to hold the phonic sounds that they already had just said, that's been really helpful for them to see the words and read those words with more fluency. Another thing to look at here, and we can put this in the chat, this is an abridged version of the Making Sense of the Decision Tree, which is an ONlit resource. This is what we could do if you're not sure what the next steps are. Again, starting from the bottom, if we have issues with phoneme segmentation fluency, if they are weak, we can teach those skills that they need. If they're proficient, great. Let's move on to that explicit systematic phonics instruction with decoding and spelling. When we're looking at the decoding, again, if those skills are weak, we do need to go backwards and look at those phonemic awareness skills. But if they're proficient, let's move on to teaching those higher, more advanced skills like multisyllabic word reading and keeping a lot of that text level reading going. So I've got my diagnostic data. It's telling me that I need to do digraphs and blends. I've got my screener data that tells me that they're not reading whole words very well and that I need to do more phonemic awareness. How am I putting that all together? So just a reminder, this is the context that I was dealing with. These are my students. 4 students working beyond the grade 1 scope and sequence. A good chunk of my group, 11 students working at grade level. They're able to work independently and they're reading words with CVCs, digraphs, and blends. 4 students who needed support to read those CVC digraphs and blends, and then 3 students who really needed intensive support to move beyond missing some alphabet sounds and moving into that grade 1 scope and sequence. I also mixed in here have 5 step 2 MLL learners who mostly are having issues on their ability to spell words, but it was still a factor that I needed to keep into context. So thinking about the language block, and you'll see here that I use block in quotations because not all of us are given a block of time. And I have been very fortunate. Again, I will acknowledge my privilege here. When you see how much time I have for literacy, you might get a little bit frustrated, but I will acknowledge that. We will talk about what we can do if we don't have all of the time together. And everything that I'm showing you here, that strand A, is all woven throughout all of these other pieces. We want to make sure that we are spending a lot of time teaching those foundations of language. That comes through strand B, right? We've got that oral language, the B2, which is most of those reading skills, B3, which is the syntax and sentence structure, those writing skills. We've got strand C, where we are understanding and responding to text. And of course, strand D, where we're expressing those ideas and we're creating texts for various purposes. Those are all of the things that I'm trying to squeeze in to my day. And here's how I do it. If it'll go, there we go. Now, if you are a math person, you are immediately noticing that that does not equal 100 minutes. No, I do have more than 100 minutes in my day for literacy. That is a choice that I have consciously made because all of the other subjects are a lot easier to teach when my students can read and write. So I'm focusing a lot of time on those skills to make those other classes go a little bit more smoothly. We're going to go bit by bit so I can show you all of these pieces, but this is the rough estimate. It does change from day to day, but on average, this is about how much time I'm spending in each of these sections. So let's look. I start with a soft entry. A large reason why I start with soft entry is I do have students who are late. We are in a walking community, but a lot of kids get dropped off. They're not always coming into my classroom. They straggle in for the first 10 minutes. We also have a very lengthy announcement happening in our class. So even though we start at 9:10, I don't usually get to start instruction till about 9:20, 9:28 when the announcements are finally over. But I'm making use of that time. That soft entry is where I do my one-on-one support. As the kids that I need show up, I pull them over to my table and we work very intensively in 1 or 2 kids at a time on the skills that they are lagging on, things that they need to be supported on. So I use that time very purposefully. It's not just a setup time. We the kids who need it get that extra support during that time. We do have a very efficient morning routine where we run through our calendar. I do have a star student and we do an oral language prompt. This is also where I sometimes will throw in a little bit of a teaser of something that we're going to learn later on in the day. And I do that through my oral language prompt. What you'll see here, they really, right now, my kids are loving Which One Doesn't Belong. So you can see this is just a TPT resource. There's lots of free ones. You can absolutely make your own, but we have really great conversations and we build their oral language capabilities. They'll tell me that, number 2 doesn't belong. And then they have to defend their thinking. They have to use those higher order thinking skills to explain why they're doing that. I mentioned earlier that I do have some multilingual learners in my classroom. This is a great, fun way for them to build their language skills and that I can do it in a supportive way. You can also see here that this is obviously not the actual names of my students in my class, but this is sort of the list that I keep for those soft entry. The list of kids who need support with high frequency words or the 3-part drill, or if they're doing phonemic awareness. And as those kids show up, I can just check off the list that I've met with them and I can do it in small groups, but I have it all ready to go. That's in that soft entry. We then move into our explicit instructions in phonics, phonemic awareness, and morphology. So this is sort of the meat of what we are doing this day. This is where the majority of my time is spent. On Mondays, it does go a little bit longer than 20 minutes, again, because that is where I'm putting the majority of my new concepts. I teach that on there. So again, we already determined that my whole group when I started was with digraphs and blends. We are now firmly into Magic-E. We're trucking along that scope and sequence. But you can see that I have the opportunity to use that soft entry to also support students who might be a little bit further behind, but I can also integrate that in. You will notice too, along with the color coding that you'll see coming up, is that I like to do the same thing every day of the week. So on Mondays, I do the same thing every Monday. On Tuesdays, it's the same thing. My students love that type of repetition. They love that they know what is happening from week to week, and we're able to spend more time on the actual instruction of the skill than trying to explain what I'm doing. They know what to expect. So you can see I'm doing that new concept and the review of that concept, and I'm using that scope and sequence. I'm using that 3-part routine, which we will go into in a little bit. I'm using lots of engaging games. We're looking at decoding, encoding, high frequency words, multisyllabic words, and the plan is to do this over the course of the week. Again, if you're using UFly, that's already decided for you. Your day 1 lesson, your day 2 lesson, your day 1 lesson, your day 2 lesson, and your progress monitoring. It's a great program for that because of that structure. We then move into that connected practice. I used to call this small group learning, but then I realized that I can't get to all of my small groups. So instead, I've reframed it as the students are independently practicing the skills that are directly related to what we just taught. So if they were just taught decoding practice, that's what we're practicing. If it's more on encoding, we're practicing that. This gives me the opportunity to pull the students during this time who need my support, but that might change over time. Like every day, it might be a different group of kids. It might be the same kid every day of the week. We then move into that snack or brain break because they've just been working really, really hard for the last hour. But again, this I got from Kate Wynn. This is not a rest time for me when they're eating their snack. I'm actually reading a novel to them or a chapter book. It is a wonderful time to practice those skills. I can model what adult reading looks like. We can make sure that we are tracking our knowledge over the time, because I can talk about what happened the day before that or what happened the day before that. The kids love being read to during their snack. From that point of, after they've been freshly fed and they are ready to go, that's when I found the best way to do my writing. So again, I'll have an explicit instruction on syntax and grammar or capitalization and punctuation, one of these concepts, or a writing form, and then we have time to directly practice that skill. Lastly, you'll see that I have Strand C. Now in my schedule, which you'll see, my Strand C is actually outside of my language block. I do have 120 minutes. Again, 20 minutes of that is mostly announcements in O Canada. So it's really a 100-minute block. But I chose to make that Strand C outside of the block because I wanted to make sure I gave it the time that it needed. If you don't have that luxury, you could just flip-flop between doing writing one day and reading one day, writing one day, reading one day. That would work. So I know this is very small, but as I mentioned to you, I do love a color code. Anything yellow is language, right? So you can see I do have an interrupted language block one day a week. I have a prep that time. That's the only time that they could come. So it is split. While I am lucky to have all of these pieces together most of the time, it doesn't have to be that way. Again, if you were at Laura Bross's webinar, then you saw that she gave so many amazing scenarios on how you might separate it out. We'll put that in the chat again. But it's the idea of like, what should stay together? In my opinion, keeping that B2, that phonics instruction and that intensive support, keep it together as a 30 or 40-minute section. You can absolutely put that syntax, the foundations of writing and the creating of text together. And then of course that Strand C can stand on its alone. One thing that you might consider doing that is really wonderful, and again, look at Laura's Instagram, Miss Bross Learns, if you want to see how she does it in her 2-3 class, is link the writing and reading comprehension with your social studies and science. That is a great way to get more language into your social studies and science, but also get more time to work on those skills. So you can absolutely keep those separated. If you have to, again, it's ideal to keep it together. But if you do need to separate them out, thinking about grouping those strands in a specific way, that would help you out. And again, look at the templates that Laura fleshed out that are on the ONlit website. So I talked a little bit about my block and what some of those instructional routines are and what that connected practice. The thing that works the most, and this comes again from my Orton Gillingham background, but it is repeated in UFly. It's in a lot of these commercial products, is something called the 3-part routine or the 3-part drill. And what that is it has a visual component. So these are the cards that I use. You can use your smartboard if you have it. I like using cards. I show them a sound. They say what the sound is. That's that visual part. The auditory part is I'm going to say a sound and they are going to write that on a corresponding surface. They could write it on paper. They could write it on whiteboards. Management of tools and resources is a big deal in grade 1. I just keep everything in a Ziploc bag. It doesn't seal, but that's okay. They've got their marker, they've got their eraser, they've got their whiteboard, and then we pass it out as we need to go. The last thing is this idea of blending these sounds together while switching sounds. And I have a video to show you in a second. This 3-part routine, I do it 3 times a week. That's been really useful. The kids who need it get it more. So I might have students who get it the 3 times a week. I do a whole class, plus they're getting it when I bring them over for their soft entry, their one-on-one, and they might get it again in their small group when I pull over that small group and connected practice. So that routine is really useful and really helps build the automaticity, both with the letter sounds as well as that blending. I've talked about the soft entry. So here's again what I do. I pull kids individually or in groups of 2, and I might work on that 3-part routine. I might work on word chaining with a blending board. I might have them segment sounds with visuals, like show up little cards. There's lots of different things. The intervention changes as the skills become proficient. I use that soft entry for that intervention. By doing that, it provides me the time to give students who need the extra one-on-one time. but I don't do it at the cost of other students, right? They're not, it's not costing me any time with my other students because this is kind of a dead time in my timetable. So when we look at that, I'm going to show you, here's a video of me doing a sound, like we're working on, this is back when we were working on getting each letter sound. And I'm using actually the mnemonic devices cards from ONlit. So it had the card on one side and then it had an embedded mnemonic or a picture that shows what that sound makes. Ready? What about this one? Oh, let's look at the picture. We've got an umbrella. Can you say umbrella? You got it. U says. Very good. Let's do it again. Say the whole thing. U says. Very good. So what you will notice there is my classroom is not quiet. I have very loud children in the background who are engaged in whatever it is that they're engaged in that matter. And you can't wait for perfection. You can't wait for a super quiet time. Intervention has to happen when the kids need it. And what it is really just intentionally working on skills that those students are lagging. It doesn't need to be perfect. Ready? What about this one? What you're going to see in this video, again, is that blending drill. Again, I'm using the small cards because that's what I have. That's what's in front of me, and that's what's useful. What's this one?
Fox. It's cracks. Crack.
So you can even hear in the background in that one, the announcements were starting, right? Like I really do this in the morning right before those announcements are happening. The other thing that I do in my class that has been really useful is encoding practice. So we're using them intentional practice on spelling words using the sounds, right? This gets them used to writing words. It also gets them used to breaking words into phonemes and also thinking about those, the morphemes that we have coming up, right? Like if there's S's at the end of things, we can intentionally talk about it. So you'll see here that I do it as a whole class. I didn't necessarily start out that way, but that's where we're at with our class, that we're able to do this whole class. Here we are working on that magic E. You have bike, make it say bake. You have, like in bacon, but this is its own word. Like I'm going to bake a cake. You have bike, now make it say bake. So you could, you heard the kid who likes to shout out bacon. He's done this multiple times. He loves his word bacon. And again, I'm not saying no, because he's not wrong. Bake and bacon, it is a syllable, but we talk about how the one here we're doing, I'm giving the context for what we are trying to do there. So that would be that word chaining. You could see we went from like to bike to bake. And I'd go back and forth between words that contain magic E and words that don't contain magic E. We'll also be sure to switch our vowel sounds as well, because switching those vowel sounds, like remember, I did have students who had struggled with vowels. Doing a lot of vowel switching is a great way to do that. This is going to be the most annoying part of the evening, and I apologize in advance that this song gets stuck in your head. I teach grade 1 in a kindergarten classroom. I have a grade 1 classroom next door, and my lovely work partner gets to hear me sing this song at top volume at least 3 times a week. But this is a little game called Mingle. The kids have their whiteboards. They're going from table to table, and on the table is a picture cue that has the concept that we're working on. So you can see we're working on Magic E concept right now. So they go around and round, and when I tell them to find their magnet, they stop where they are and they read that word. Mingle, mingle, a mingle, 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 find your magnet now. Okay, my dear, what have we got? Kite. Kite.
Miss Smith, what is this?
Remember what we learned, that when we have a C and then an I, it's going to make this sound. So how do we make the K sound? What letter is the other letter that makes the K sound? Very good, write that instead.
What's this? What's this one?
That's a cage. That's a gate. There. Now, I know 2 things in that video. Her letter formation was not great, but you can see that it is functional. She is using the appropriate letter for the sounds that she's trying to get. I also know that I added a very loud schwa to my k sound, but it is hard to say that out loud and hear them hear it without adding that schwa. So if you're sitting there thinking, this lady doesn't even know her sounds, I definitely do know my sounds. The other thing that you probably heard was how many kids were calling my name. Again, I'm just trying to show you this is a real life classroom. This is not like those instructional videos where all the kids are sitting perfectly and nobody's getting up and moving around. Like these kids need my support. I'm able to support one student while still working with the other. So that is Mingle. They just go around. These are little magnets that we have. That's why you hear me say, find your magnet now. These are resources that they are accessible to them that they are constantly using to spell words with. Another thing that we've started doing, again, this is more recent, is the idea of multisyllabic word practice, right? Getting into those bigger words. We are explicitly teaching them syllable types, but we're also learning to read multisyllabic words by recognizing the morphemes that I've taught them. So it's a little bit of both. This example here, of course, we have a closed syllable as well as that magic E. If you're interested more in that multisyllabic word practice, we can throw in the chat here the poster from ONlit. It is geared for higher grades, but it is if you're still new to multisyllabic words and how you might teach them, on the back of the poster, there's some really great prompts and the script that a teacher might say. Another thing that we're working on is that fluency, right? So we use something called scooping. Scooping is literally just taking a marker and underlining in a large scoop a phrase at a time, and it challenges them to read more than one word at a time. We want to make sure that they are reading phrases of words that are meaningful, because if we go word by word all the time, that can impact our comprehension. So we look here, the original way that we might be reading a word, the dog likes to eat ice cream. By putting these visual scoops underneath, it helps them to see the larger phrases and get them going. The last one that I'm very excited to share, because this has been the biggest game changer in my classroom in terms of building fluency, is what I've just called ready for reading or ready to read. It involves students having access to a decodable book in their folder. So the thing that they hold on to from week to week, they have that decodable book. They read the decodable book to themselves or a partner, and they keep reading it until they feel comfortable enough to read to Mrs. Smith. So this is not a gotcha. I'm not trying to catch them. When they feel like they have mastered this book, they will come to me. They simply put their name on the ready list. They just write their name. And then I call them over throughout the day whenever there's small pockets of time, often when there's a transition from one activity to another, and I'll just listen to them read, and then I'll track their progress. I will say, then they get to select a new book. I will say again, I'm going to acknowledge my privilege here. I do have access to a lot of decodable text. Not through my school. I have amassed a lot of them on my own over the years. I do have a few sets with my school, which has been really helpful. You can see here that in this picture, I have decodable text at different levels. If you don't have access to decodable text, there are so many free ones. You can also use the ones that come with your program. If printing is an issue, you can, of course, upload them onto some sort of Google Classroom. The idea is to get them reading text that is connected to their concepts, as well as connected, the sentences are connected to each other so that they can build that fluency practice. What you're seeing here is just the collection of decodables that I've been using, but also a very simple Google form. I just write their name. I say what the text focus was that they were doing, that they happened to be reading to me at that time, and then any anecdotal notes. What's great about using this Google form instead of just doing it by paper is that I actually have oodles and oodles now of information about these kids. So of course I've removed their names here, but you can see that I can track the concept that they're working on and then what's happening, right? And these are very anecdotal. These are not the information that I would necessarily share directly with parents, right? Zero issue, even on 2 syllables, right? If they're not always spelled, because I'm literally doing it really quickly. But this practice of ready for reading and getting them to read the decodable text, they are so motivated to get their name on that board and have me listen to them reading. I was struggling to hear all of the kids read real text. I knew they had their word reading because of the way that we were running our program, but I was having trouble hearing all of these kids. This has made it so that over the course of the week, I hear all of my students read, sometimes more than once, because it really doesn't take very much time. They're so motivated to get that new book. They're so motivated to share their own pride. This has been the biggest game changer. I wish I had done it in kindergarten last year, but I'm so happy with how this program is going. I can also, you can see here on this text focus, I can continue to adapt this as we have more skills, right? As we're moving on, I can keep track of where the kids are at. So this has been a really great game changer for me. Just like with my explicit instruction, my connected practice is very much on Mondays we do this, on Tuesdays we do this. Again, I get to spend more time on practicing and less time on explaining what the kids need to do. I switch it up a bit, especially on the Tuesdays and Thursdays where we have a little bit more flexibility and I choose activities that match the morphemes or the high frequency words. But in terms of the practice going along with the decoding and encoding, it's very much the same thing every time. I don't have to explain for them how to do the practice anymore. Some of those practice activities do come in paper form. And at the end of that week, I just collect all of that, put it in the home reading folder, and that's what they can work on at home the following week. The reason why that is so beneficial is that I know that they've had a lot of practice with that concept, that they don't actually need the support of their parents to continue to practice. I work in a community where many of the parents, English is not their first language. And so phonics instruction and reading, they're very hesitant to engage in. I want to make sure that I'm sending home stuff that the kids are able to do independently. I might tuck a few other things in there, but in general, what we've worked on all week goes home, and so for them to practice. That also means that they get a whole week of me teaching them something and then a whole other week to practice that same concept. You can see while my kids are engaging in this activity, I'm available to work with whoever needs that support. The kids that I work with on decoding might be different than the kids that I work with on encoding. And it might be the kids who are different that need help with support with high frequency words. Having a system like this frees me up to pull whoever needs the support on that day. It also means that I might have kids that stay with me the whole time, and that's okay too. But this has been having this type of system means that every kid gets what they need when they need it. What you don't see here are centers. You don't see rotations. Those for me were impossible to manage. Maybe you have centers and you really, really like them, but not knowing what kids were doing and having them do so many different things made it really difficult for me to manage their behavior and to manage my expectations and to manage their progress. So it's not something that was working for me. So I just went away with it. They have the activity that they are must do. Then they have their ready for reading, and then they can choose an activity. Again, I will acknowledge that that comes with having a lot of resources in my classroom, but many of the resources that I have are available for free. It's just a matter of providing them to the kids. One thing that's really important to know with this connected practice is that it's completely rests on whether or not they are progressing. So progress monitoring lets me know if my instruction is working. It makes me check to see that the intervention that I'm providing with my students is effective. If it's not showing growth, then it's my job to make the changes in order to see improvement. Progress monitoring is less about the kids improving and more about me making sure that what I'm doing is having an impact. Okay. That is like, you need to understand that that's where I'm coming from with the progress monitoring. There are two ways that I do progress monitoring. One is informally, which I'm going to show you first, and then I do the formal progress monitoring that came with our universal screening. The tests that we are using, they are appropriate benchmarks, right? So I have been accused in the past when I've shared my progress monitoring that I'm teaching to the test. I view the progress monitoring from Acadians, the online screener, as being milestones that I should expect my kids to reach at certain times of the year. And so I use the progress monitoring to make sure that my kids are continuing to excel. And if they're not, then I need to do something about it. So the first type of progress monitoring that we do is the daily pen review. Again, if you saw Laura's webinar, you'll see that's something that I stole directly from her Instagram and decided to do it in my classroom. Again, we do have an ONlit resource if you are interested in that. This is an informal progress monitoring where I'm looking at their ability to write the alphabet within 30 seconds. And we are orally dictating concepts to them from the scope and sequence, and I'm getting them to write sounds, words, and sentences. I'm going to show you some examples. I hope that they show up on the screen. But here's week one of one of my students. So you can see here they had 30 seconds to write the alphabet, and they got through 3 letters. So their alphabet fluency was not very well developed. They didn't have any of the sounds. They did almost get a whole word, but they were not able to write any sentences that I was dictating. Here's that exact same student, but it's week 10. We've got halfway through the alphabet. Every single sound or collection of sounds, again, you see digraphs and blends and short vowels, they were getting. They were able to write every single magic E word, and we almost got all of the parts of that sentence. So week 1 to week 10. Here's another student. This student even struggled to get things on the right part of the paper, right? Not following the instruction. So again, we have some of the sounds. There's that digraph, sh, but she wrote it as s. We've got one word. Instead of chop, she wrote slop. And again, no real concept of the full sentence. Here's again that student on week 10. The entire alphabet. Is it perfect? No, but it is proficient. We have all of the sounds. A good amount of these magic E's. You can see we're still having trouble with that TR sound. And we've got a lot of progress here on that full sentence. Here's another one, week 1. Again, not much of the alphabet fluency is not really there. Some of the sounds are coming, no real concept of how to write a word, and no real concept of how to write a sentence. And here's that same student in week 10. We've got the entire alphabet. We've got all of the sounds that I said, making really great progress on that magic E, and a really great progress on that sentence. So you can see by tracking these 4 things, I'm able to see from week to week if they are making progress. When I look through the entire class, I'm able to decide, okay, this is a sound I should repeat again, or I think we've got good consolidation of this sound. Let's try a different sound. This type of progress monitoring has meant from week to week, I can make sure that my instruction is exactly where it needs to be. I also like to use the universal screener. I have ALO online, so Acadians Learning Online. I have the digital platform. It could not be easier with the digital platform. So please check the progress monitoring that comes with your board screener. I went ahead and looked, and Easy CBM has progress monitoring, as does Ames Web Plus. So it is there for you to use. Again, if you want support in learning how to use that, then those cat chats, those data drop-ins would be a great place to come, and we could support you through that. You want to screen any child who didn't meet the benchmark, right? So even if they overall had the benchmark, if you look at their individual subtests and they didn't quite meet the benchmark, it would be a good idea to progress monitor those students on a somewhat frequent basis. The frequency will depend on how far from the benchmark they are. So the further away from the benchmark, the more frequently that you want to check in. The reason for this, again, is we're not trying to necessarily just see if the students are developing and if their skills are progressing. We want to know if the intervention and the explicit instruction that we're going out of our way to do is actually effective. If it's not, we need to make the appropriate changes to the instruction or to our intervention. And some of those changes might be how frequently we work on that skill with them, how long we work on that skill for them, how many people we are working on at a time. So that would be your population. Maybe it needs to be a smaller group. And then, of course, those instructional approaches. What do we need to change? If you are lucky enough to have Acadians Learning Online, the data is right there for you, and the data is so lovely. You can see here, this is at the student level, looking at their progress monitoring. What we have is an aim line. It's showing you how we want to try and stay above that line. If you don't have access to that, a really simple way is to just shoot for the benchmark and shoot for the next benchmark. It's not necessarily the most scientific way to go about it, but it's going to show you if progress is being made. So when we look at this student, this was her phoneme segmentation fluency. She needed 40 sounds at the beginning of the year and she only had 19. But we continued to work both whole group and small group, and you could see that she very quickly gained the skills that she needed. And again, with this student, I was really able to see the difference in her spelling. So she directly benefited from that phoneme segmentation work because her spelling now was containing more sounds. When we looked at her correct letter sounds, she was actually kind of okay. She wasn't too far from where she needed to be, but I was concerned about her whole word reading. She didn't really have, she wasn't reading any words as whole. So when we worked with her for a bit and then I retested, you can see that her correct letter sounds went down, but her whole word reading went way up. So while she was reading words not perfectly fluently, it was at the expense of her correct letter sounds. She was making a lot of gains. Here's another student. Again, the sounds for the phoneme segmenting were not too far off of the benchmark of where she needed to be, but with a little bit of intervention, we were able to see huge growth for her on her ability to segment sounds. This was a student who refused to write because she could not think of how to spell words. And now the student just writes a mile a minute because she understands the concepts behind that. When we look at her correct letter sounds, she was sort of plugging along, nothing too concerning. She was making some great gains and they were quite consistent and she was well along the path to where she needed to be. But when you look at her whole word reading, we had 2 sets of progress monitoring. So these were about 6 weeks total apart from these 3 scores. And you see that she had 3 zeros in a row. And that just was not okay with me. It told me that my intervention wasn't working. Yes, she was gaining sounds and she was becoming more fluent, but she was not actually applying that knowledge. She wasn't showing proficiency with that alphabetic principle. So I changed my instruction. This red line shows the exact moment when I decided to do things differently. I got 3 zeros in a row. She wasn't making any changes. She wasn't making any progress. So I changed what I was doing with her. And you can see from the moment that I changed what I was doing with her, her ability to read whole words skyrocketed. She went to 5 and then doubled that again. And that's because the data showed me that I was not effective. So I changed what I did. And now I found something that was working for her. I've heard a lot of people refer to both the progress monitoring as well as the Acadians benchmarks as being just a snapshot in time, right? It's just like a little picture of what's happening. But I'm hoping that I'm proving to you that this is really a powerful tool to provide feedback both like to the teacher on whether or not what they are doing is effective for that student. When we look at the whole class data, it gets even more exciting. So here is my phoneme segmentation that I showed you before, about half my class not meeting benchmark. The most recent results show this. I still have students not quite at the benchmark, but you can see there's a huge improvement. When I look at my nonsense word fluency, again, I had 6 kids who did not have fluency with correct letter sounds. Now I have everybody. So every single one of my class has made the benchmark for correct letter sounds. They have the fluency and the automaticity with those letters to read words. When we look at the whole words, again, I separated out the above and the above at and above, just to sort of indicate, because I did have students that while they were meeting that benchmark, they really only had one word and that just was not comfortable enough because that was the lowest level of okay. Here's where we're at now. You can see that the majority of my students are well above where they need to be, and that I've just got this one kid left. Now, I will say this kid has been on an extended vacation and I haven't seen her since for a very long time. So hopefully when she comes back, we'll be able to work with her. But the other thing that I wanted you to think about was this. I've made these kids a little bit darker because these kids are actually already meeting the January benchmark. So that to me is really motivating data to show me that what I'm doing in my class is having an impact. It's not just in my head. I can actually see it both in the progress of when they're reading actual text to me, but also in how they're doing on these progress monitoring. Again, I have been accused of teaching to the test. I promise you, I am not sitting there getting them to read nonsense words until they figure out how to do it. We're just simply giving them the skills that they need to have a very strong alphabetic principle so that they can move themselves forward. So again, these were my initial groups, right? I've been doing all of this work. All of it is just to say to you that the groups are going to change. I have the students, those 4 students, that group of 11, and then those kids who needed that support. Well, now I still have those 4 kids way above and beyond. I have 5 students who are completely proficient with Magic E. They are reading multisyllabic words within the concepts that we've already taught. I've got these 11 students who are doing really well with Magic E. We've only been doing it for 3 weeks, and they're developing that fluency, and they require very minimal support. And that's left me with just 1 student who needs my daily support in reading those CBC and digraphs. I know I've been talking for a very, very long time, and I hope we can get through some of these chats. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. I hope that you have been able to see that we have that connection between the diagnostic and the screening data, as well as what we do with that data. If you have more questions, we do have a screening data chat happening tomorrow at 4:30. If you're not already registered, we can put that link in the chat there. But to sum it all up, what we really want to think about is that screening and diagnostic data can be used to determine an instructional starting point within the new curriculum. We can use that data to decide where to start and how fast to go. We know that our whole group instruction should meet the needs of the majority of the students in that class, and that we can use that progress monitor to ensure that our instruction is working. And if it's not working, we can do something about it. That's all I've got for you. I can see that the chat's got a lot going on there. I'm not sure if there's anything going on in the question box there, but Alicia, if you got anything for me? You might still be on mute.
I'm not sure if Alicia's here, but I'm happy.
Oh, you're still there. There you go.
Okay, great. I'm happy to jump in. I just want to see if we can just give a couple, because I know we were really hoping to close at 8:30. A question I had, Melissa, can you unpack a little bit more about how you use your diagnostic? Are you looking for a criterion of 10 out of 10? Like, what criterion are you looking at when you're looking at diagnostic data? There are many options, but we're just going to pick a few.
So I know, like, if you're looking at core phonics, they have you do it based on like how many out of 10 they got right. For me, it is a little bit more loosey-goosey on a feeling. Do they have proficiency with that? Are they doing it laboriously, or are they doing it with some ease? So I'm really looking at that fluency. If they see a word that contains a digraph, are they reading it like that, or are they having to sound it out? So for me, it's more about the fluency, because I want to build the fluency with one concept before I move on to that next concept.
Great. A question as well. Can you talk about how you do the review with Laura's daily pen review? Do you ad lib the words and phrases that you use for that, or how do you determine what concept you are practicing with?
So it's my scope and sequence. So it is whatever, I'm just trying to find it here. It's whatever we are working on at that time. So right now we're doing Magic E. So you can see this was last week. We had just done Magic E with I and Magic E with A. So that's why you see a lot of the words with I and A. This week we're working on Magic E with O. So I will have a word with a word with I, and a couple words with O. I often will throw in a high frequency word. So it's really about checking to see the proficiency with the skills that I'm teaching them at that moment.
Fantastic. And I have one last one, and then maybe Alicia, if you have any I'm happy to have you jump in, but I know you mentioned a little bit about what that connected practice looks like. Can you clarify, is that something that follows a daily 5 type structure? What is it that has led you to sort of make your structure the way it is for student independent practice?
I would say that if daily 5 is over here on the far side, I'm on the other side of that. For me personally, as an adult trying to manage things, daily 5 was too much for me to manage. I also didn't like how in that program, there was a lot of assumptions that the child had the skills that they needed to accomplish those tasks. My diagnostics told me, especially at the beginning, that only a few students in my class were able to read words independently and fluently enough to gain comprehension from that. So it didn't make sense for me to have them independently reading and writing, or even with a partner, without much more focus. So instead, I have when I was teaching in a support center, we called it a job binder system. So they had a task that they were required to do, and that is mostly what the whole class is doing. And then they had some optional tasks that were related to the skill that we were practicing. So in our class, we are decoding on Mondays, and then they can choose from a decoding bin, which is a lot of different activities that focus on decoding. On Wednesdays, it could be encoding. And I should say, and I don't think I mentioned it there, that group of 4 that's beyond, they're not doing that practice. Their connected practice was all on comprehension and vocabulary because that's what they needed. They were not getting the skills that they had already mastered. They were getting the opportunity to practice skills beyond where the scope and sequence, because that's what they needed. That was their differentiation.
Fantastic. I'm just looking at the clock and I see that it is 8:30. So I know there are some questions we didn't get to. What I will say is we do have a fabulous team of Ontario educators who are just delighted to receive your questions. If there's anything that if this sparked anything and you've got questions of your own, or if we didn't get to any of them, please send us an email, info@onlit.org. One of our wonderful educators would be happy to support you with whatever questions pop up. And if we're going to be seeing you tomorrow afternoon at the data chat, we're looking forward to see you then too. And a very, 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 very big thank you to the fabulous Melissa Smith. I think this was a masterclass tonight in terms of some, a window inside of a really skilled educator's mind of how she's structuring her instruction and how she's meeting her students' needs. So I'm so thankful for you sharing your insight with you. We're so grateful, and we're grateful to everybody who joined. I hope you stay warm. For me, it's a snowy evening, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.